In week 1, we said clearly we don't teach the prosperity gospel. We do not preach the poverty gospel. Those are both distortions on biblical teaching. And a lot of times, these are taught by people who really believe it and they have a good heart behind it. And then there are some people who I think are teaching this maliciously, and I believe they're heretics. Regardless, it's really obvious. The prosperity gospel, it's obvious. There is another incorrect biblical teaching that is all throughout our churches, and it is taught by great men and women of God who love the Lord and are leading really good churches, but I believe they are wrong on their interpretation and that it is hurting the church, and it's hurting how we talk about generosity. Probably even in the church you grew up in, if you grew up in church, they taught the tithe. This is the teaching that God commands 10% of your income to go to God through the local church. Now, there is a more insidious version of teaching on the tithe, which has become really mainstream in evangelical churches today, and it goes like this. If you give 9% of your money to the church, your other 91% in your bank account is cursed. If you give 9.9% of your income to the church, the 90.1% of your money in the bank is cursed. But if you give 10%, your other 90 will receive blessings on blessings on blessings. The reason the tithe is taught so broadly is because the tithe was taught in the Old Testament. The Old Testament law was written to the nation of Israel, and much of the law organized the theocratic kingdom of Israel. You might find it interesting that the Old Testament law does not prescribe one tithe, it prescribes 3. You gave 2 tithes, 2 tenths every year, and you gave a 3rd tithe every 3 years. That equals to roughly 23 1/3 of your income going to the government of Israel every year. The tithe in the Old Testament was the tax system for the nation of Israel. We now live under a new covenant, and as believers in the church, we are not held to the Old Testament law. We're held in many ways to the higher standard of the teachings of Jesus and the teachings of the apostle. And so what did Paul say? This is his teaching to the church on giving. Paul did not say, each person better give their 10%, because if you don't give your full 10%, you are cursed to no end. Paul said each person should do as he has decided in his heart. I'm not mad at the idea of 10%. As a matter of fact, it might be a really good goal for you to aspire to as you're trying to increase your generosity. Here's the problem. The problem is when you teach someone who can only give 6%, that's all they can give right now, and you say if you only give 6%, your money's cursed, and if you give 0%, your money's cursed, guess what they're gonna give? 0%. It's cursed either way, and I can have more money every month. The problem too is on the flip side. There are some people who God has just blessed abundantly, and they're at a place in their financial life where 10% would just not be a sacrifice. They could lose 10% of their money every month and not know it. But they give 10 because that's what's commanded, and it's actually holding them back from giving sacrificially. The problem with the tithe is that on both ends of the spectrum, it ends up limiting God's people. I love what Paul says. He says, each person should do as he's decided in his heart, not reluctantly, not out of compulsion, because God loves a cheerful giver. It's not just what we give, it also speaks to how we give. When we are living with this pilgrim's perspective, keeping our eyes on Jesus and eternity, we will be joyous to give back to God. If you were giving in 2024, you probably just received your end of the year giving statement. And you know, MetaChurch is a nonprofit according to the IRS, and so you get some tax incentives for giving here. And it's not why we do it, but it is nice. And you know, it's like if you gave reluctantly all year long, then you're gonna see that number of what you gave in 2024, and your first thought's gonna be like, I could have done so many things with this money. You know, so many things I could have fixed. upgraded. There's so many things I could have bought. If you are giving cheerfully with the pilgrim's perspective, not out of compulsion, not out of reluctance, you're gonna see that number. And maybe last year you expanded your giving. My family, we looked and expanded this year. We're gonna expand again. You see that number and you go, 2024, 139 baptisms. 2024, we opened a second location. Marriages healed, kids finding their confidence in the Lord, addictions overcome, graduates in the academy, like God is moving and you're overjoyed, and it's like, how do I invest more into this? How do I give more of what God has given me? How do we see more blessing in our world?